It is the resistance report for April 26, 2017. And the theme for tonight is class warfare. That is what Donald Trump and his administration have declared. If he didn't declare it before today, they certainly did declare it today. Their new tax plan, for example, the details of which I'll get to in a moment. Also, their attempt to revive the, in turn, attempt to repeal Obamacare, and a lot of other things. I want to mention just a few of them, but again, the purpose of our resistance reports is to give you context, to connect the dots, and to show you that there is a pattern here. And when I say class warfare, I'm obviously referring to the class that Donald Trump belongs to, and the billionaires in the Trump administration, versus the rest of us, the working class, the poor, the middle class. Most of us are actually going to be disadvantaged by most of the things that Donald Trump is proposing. And the question is, when will Trump supporters, who are going to be among the most disadvantaged, when will they catch on? Let me give an example. Today, the big unveiling of Trump's tax plan, particularly corporate tax reduction. Steve Mnuchin, who is the Treasury Secretary, former hedge fund manager, former partner in Goldman Sachs, what he said was, this is the biggest tax cut and largest tax reform in the history of our country. Hello? Using some of the language that Donald Trump might even use. In reality, it's the biggest declaration of class warfare in history, Trump's and Mnuchin's as well, I guess the rest of us. Number one, you cut corporate tax rates from 35% to 15%, you are giving a huge benefit to people who own shares of stock. And most of the shares of stock in this country, 80% of them, by value, are owned by the top 10% of Americans. The top 1%, the richest 1%, they own 20% of the shares of stock. So as you cut corporate tax rates, you are adding value to their stock portfolios. There should be no question about that. And also, who's going to pay the price when we have a larger deficit? Or we cut programs for the poor and the working class and the lower middle class? It should be obvious. He also, that is, Trump also wants to cut individual taxes paid by partners. Now, this is something you didn't hear much about today, but it's there in the tax plan. They want to cut, listen to this, they want to cut taxes paid by partners of hedge funds and private equity funds and, not the least, real estate empires. Get it? Donald Trump, his own business. They're going to cut those taxes of those people from the current level, which is 39.6%, that's the official tax rate, the top marginal tax rate, down to 15%, by allowing all of their income basically to pass through and be charged as if they were actual businesses getting the 15% tax rate. Obviously, they're individuals who are raking in a lot of money. Third, they want to repeal the estate tax. Now, Republicans for years have been calling this the death tax and been scaring people about it. Let me be clear. This tax affects the richest 2% of Americans, at most. And it doesn't hurt farm owners. It doesn't hurt small business owners. The tax doesn't really hurt anybody, but it's paid by the richest 2% in terms of wealth, not in terms of income, in terms of wealth, and their heirs. But Trump wants to get rid of it. Also, did I say that Trump is now proposing another repeal of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that would save the richest among us $300 billion a year, over and above all of the other tax advantages that Trump is now proposing. The biggest winners of all of this, in terms of tax warfare, who are the biggest winners? They are Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner and also the Robert Mercer. Do you remember Robert Mercer? Have you heard of Robert Mercer? He is Steve Bannon's funder. When Steve Bannon was at Breitbart News, let's call it, the money to support Breitbart came from this extraordinarily wealthy person named Robert Mercer. He also gains enormously from these Trump-proposed tax cuts, and his daughter Rebecca, who's now bankrolling a super PAC that is running pro-Trump ads. She's also a huge beneficiary of this, not to mention Steve Mnuchin himself and all the other billionaires that Trump has brought into his administration, Gary Cohn, Rex Tillerson, Betsy DeVos, and others on Wall Street, and others at the highest reaches of corporate America. The biggest losers, average working Americans, many of whom voted for Donald Trump, who will now have, what, fewer government services, number one. They will have to pay more taxes to make up the difference, and more of their taxes are going to go to pay interest on a larger federal debt. And by the way, who are they actually going to end up paying interest to? Who is it who owns the federal debt, or at least who is it who holds all the government bonds? Well, some of them are foreigners, that's true. Some of them are Chinese, but a lot of that federal debt is owned by, you guessed it, the wealthiest Americans. You know, 60 years ago, wealthy Americans used to support the federal government by paying taxes. Under Eisenhower, the top tax rate was 91%. And even after deductions and tax credits, the top tax rate effectively that the rich paid in the United States in the 1950s and early 1960s was 52%. Now it's down way, way below that, and the rich support the federal government by lending the federal government money in the form of treasury bonds. And those treasury bonds are supported in turn by taxpayers who pay interest on those bonds. So Trump's proposals, his tax plan, is a win-win-win, a triple win for the wealthiest members of our society. When do you suppose Trump supporters are going to catch on to any of this? He's just going to continue. He's going to hold a rally Saturday. He's going to continue to say, well, he's doing everything for working Americans and people with only a high school degree. Well, the fact of the matter is they are being shafted by this administration as never before. Oh, I forgot to mention, another part of Trump's tax plan is a one-time, quote-unquote, one-time tax amnesty for the biggest American corporations who have all of this money parked abroad in low-tax jurisdictions, in tax shelters. They've got more than $1 trillion parked, of their earnings parked abroad. And what is it doing parked abroad? Well, basically they're waiting for another tax amnesty where they can bring the money back at a low tax rate. And that's exactly what Donald Trump and his administration are proposing. Corporations, you bring your money back to the United States, money parked abroad, we will tax you at a very, very low rate in this one-time tax amnesty, and that's going to generate a lot of new investment, a lot of new jobs. That's what the Treasury Department under Trump is now saying. What they forget on purpose, or don't want you to know on purpose, is that in 2004, the George W. Bush administration also announced a, quote, one-time tax amnesty for big corporations to take the money that they had parked abroad, not nearly as much, and bring it home and be subject to a 5% corporate income tax, way, way lower than anything that they would otherwise have had to pay. Bush said it was going to be a one-time tax amnesty, bring it home now, and that is going to generate all sorts of new jobs, new investments. Guess what? It didn't. In fact, it had the opposite result. The 15 biggest companies that benefited from that tax amnesty, they actually cut a total of net 20,000 jobs. They cut their research budgets. They cut their investments in equipment, machinery, and they also started putting even more of their earnings abroad in tax shelters after they got the amnesty. Why? Because they knew there'd be another amnesty. It's not a one-time tax amnesty. In fact, every time you provide an amnesty, you create incentives for big corporations to put even more money abroad in tax shelters, expecting that there will be another one-time tax amnesty. More class warfare from Donald Trump and company. Meanwhile, in their latest plan to repeal and so-called replace, it's not really replacing, it's basically just repealing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, House Republicans, the House Freedom Caucus Republicans, and that's about 3 dozen hardline conservatives who, you remember, have been key to blocking Trump's repeal of the Affordable Care Act last month. Today, they approved a new and even more conservative version of the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and thereby breathed new life into the entire repeal effort. There could be a vote by Friday, by this Friday, by the day after tomorrow, on this repeal. Paul Ryan will count noses. If he thinks that he has enough House Republicans, he is going to actually call for a vote. Now, what the plan is, clearly, is they get this Freedom Caucus, these most conservative House Republicans, to buy on to this repeal plan, and that they think is going to intimidate the more moderate House Republicans into signing on, for fear that they just don't want to face voters, Republican voters, and be the ones who brought the plan down, the repeal down. So it's a kind of intimidation plan, really. What's the key to it? Well, number one, it lets states decide whether to maintain the minimum health benefits that are in the Affordable Care Act. You know, under the Affordable Care Act, every insurance company, every health insurance company has got to offer a minimum package of benefits. But under this new Republican plan, no, a state can opt out and allow its insurance companies to not offer those minimum benefits. And those minimum benefits include maternity care, mental health, substance abuse, emergency services. They don't have to do that anymore. That's a huge, huge benefit to the insurance companies. States, under this new Republican plan, could decide they're not going to offer the minimum benefits. And also, and here's a very, very big one, states could opt out of requiring insurers to provide benefits at the same price to people with pre-existing health conditions. In other words, the big deal, one of the centerpieces of the Affordable Care Act, of Obamacare, is the notion that we're all in the same risk pool together. Whether we have health problems or we don't have health problems, we're all in the same risk pool together. Insurers have got to charge us the same in terms of premiums. But once states are allowed to opt out, that means they can charge huge premiums to people with pre-existing conditions, making it impossible for them to afford health care, essentially. In other words, states can rip out the guts of the Affordable Care Act. That's what this Republican plan is all about. It sounds like states' rights. It sounds really nice. Well, shouldn't states have the option? No. It's actually ripping out the guts of the Affordable Care Act, essentially repealing it. And also, not incidentally, getting rid of Medicaid expansion, the expansion of Medicaid. Millions of people. I mean, that means essentially you have potentially 24 million people losing their health insurance. This is what the conservative Republicans are now proposing, and the question is, will moderate Republicans go along? Or will they be so intimidated into not fearing that they're not going to be fearing that they are going to be the ones to be blamed in the midterms? By the way, the whole purpose here, and this goes back to class warfare, the whole purpose of doing any of this, why should they, do they just want to be cruel? the Republicans? Well, maybe, but one of the practical purposes is by doing this, they can reduce the taxes on wealthy Americans that were built into the Affordable Care Act. In other words, they can reduce taxes on the wealthy by about $300 billion a year, on top of the tax breaks that were announced today for the wealthy. Again, class warfare by Trumps and Mnuchin's and the billionaire class against the rest of us. Meanwhile, Trump's budget plan would expand the military budget by $54 billion a year. That's about 10%, while cutting programs for the poor and near poor, even Meals on Wheels. Do you get the pattern here? We have not seen anything like this. I mean, I was there when Ronald Reagan proposed his huge cuts in programs for the poor and military expansion and tax cuts. I was around when George W. Bush proposed big tax cuts for the rich. Trickle-down economics. Baloney. Trickle-down economics doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. We've been through it with Reagan. We've been through it with George W. Bush. They said it would help everybody. The benefits would trickle down. It would pay for itself. It didn't pay for itself, and nothing trickled down. For 35 years, the median earnings in the United States have gone nowhere adjusted for inflation. And if you don't have a college degree, you're on a downward escalator. And that's actually one of the reasons Donald Trump won. So many people were so angry. The game seemed rigged in favor of the billionaire class. And it is still rigged in favor of the billionaire class. And Donald Trump is doing the rigging for the billionaire class. One more thing that shows the same pattern. And I want to refer to a White House statement. It did not get much traction yesterday, much press, but it did get out to a lot of people. This was a White House statement in response to, you remember, the federal district judge who declared unconstitutional the Trump administration's attack on sanctuary cities. The judge said, you can't do it, Trump administration, because only Congress has the spending power. You don't have the spending power. It's unconstitutional for you to basically say that you're not going to provide a whole bunch of federal grants to cities and states that have declared themselves sanctuary cities and states. All right, you remember that. So what did the Trump White House say? I'm going to read this. This is not just a 6 a.m. tweet by Donald Trump before he has actually had any time to think. This is a White House statement. Now listen to this. Quote, the San Francisco judges. Let me stop right there. Notice that they say the San Francisco judge. You notice how they're trying to already demean the judge by making him seem like a liberal from San Francisco? The San Francisco judge's erroneous ruling is a gift to the criminal gang and cartel element in our country. This is the White House, a statement thought out by the White House, presumably, empowering the worst kind of human trafficking and sex trafficking and putting thousands of innocent lives at risk. This is all the White House statement. This case is yet one more example of egregious overreach by a single, unelected district judge. You see what this is doing? I have been in and around government for 50 years. I have never, ever seen a White House, heard a White House that would demean, degrade, criticize a federal judge as being unelected. And therefore, by implication, he has no right to find something that the White House did unconstitutional. That itself is unconstitutional. You see, we have a system of checks and balances. We expect our president and our White House to respect the judiciary, which, as Alexander Hamilton said in The Federalist, has neither the sword nor the purse. That is, it doesn't have the power of an army. It doesn't have the power of spending. All it has is the power of public trust and credibility. And here we have the White House condemning somebody as a single, unelected district judge. This is a part of a pattern. This is a direct attack, once again, on our democratic system of governance. Once again, we have the Trump administration, including Donald Trump, seeking to plant in the public's mind some sort of idea that Trump should be what? A dictator? Not have to be in any way constrained by the judiciary of the United States? All right, let me take your questions. Matt Rose. Can Trump actually break up the Ninth Circuit Court like he is now saying he will, since they keep upholding the law against his attacks? Matt, no, Trump cannot constitutionally break up the Ninth Circuit Court. But does that mean he won't try? If he does try, I'll tell you something, that is another ground for impeachment. Tim Rowan, has there ever been a time in history when tax cuts for the wealthy directly caused a general economic boom that made up for the lost tax revenue? I always hear this theory promoted but do not know if this has ever come true. Tim, it has never, ever come true. In fact, there was a study by the Congressional Research Service 2 years ago that looked at the last 65 years and looked at every tax cut passed by Congress to see if there was any relationship between any of those tax cuts and economic growth. And you know something? There was none. No relationship whatsoever. I was part of an administration that actually raised taxes. The Clinton administration raised taxes, and we had one of the longest and strongest economic booms in American history. 22 million net new jobs created. Okoko Kafwada, is universal basic income the solution to extreme income inequality in the United States? Well, it's not on the table right now. Universal basic income is something that is being tested in a variety of places right now. Oakland, California, for example, has a test to see what people do. Now, a lot of conservatives say if people did get a basic income, regardless of whether they worked, what are they going to do? They're just going to sit around. They're not going to do anything. They're going to buy liquor, or they're going to, whatever they're going to do, that is going to be a bad thing. But other economists and other social scientists say eventually we're going to have a minimum basic income because more and more technology is going to be replacing more and more jobs, and it's not going to be a minimum basic income that keeps people happy and well-fed and well-housed, but it's going to at least maintain them so they and their families don't fall into extreme poverty. And that may be something that is important. We should know more about it over the next few years. Celeste Connor. Is it time for the creation of a new People's Progressive Party? Under what circumstances would the creation of such a party be a wise and viable step for voters in this country? Celeste, if the Democratic Party continues to be nothing but a vast fundraising machine, unrelated to the real needs of most people, and unrelated to all of the grassroots organizing that is now happening not only against Trump, but also to advance a progressive agenda. If the Democratic Party continues to be moribund, essentially, then I do believe there will be a void, and that void could be filled by a third party, a People's Party. Now, here's the danger. Every time there has been a third party in the United States, it has drawn votes away from the party that is ideologically closest to it in a general election. So we've got to be very, very careful that we don't do that again. Because in a winner-take-all system, like we have, a winner-take-all system, we've got to be careful that a People's Party doesn't wreck or draw votes away from the Democrats and reward Republicans even more votes. I think it's possible. I think there are a lot of people out there, independents, even some Republicans and many Democrats, who say to themselves, we are all being shafted. The deck is stacked against all of us by the rich and powerful and privileged, and if we all got together, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, poor and working class and middle class coalition, we could actually regain control of our democracy and also our economy. But that may take a lot of organizing and a lot of years. Time for 2 more questions. John Baumgartner. Is there really any way, through concerted effort and activism, to undo Citizens United? I've almost given up. John, first of all, don't give up. There is a way of undoing Citizens United, if not by more votes on the Supreme Court, and Gorsuch is not going to be the last Supreme Court justice. I think the Supreme Court eventually will see the light, because a lot of what was predicted by the Supreme Court justices that voted in favor of Citizens United in terms of it not having the effects it is now having of drowning out the voices of most people has not come to pass. In fact, it has drowned out the voices of most people. And so the Supreme Court, although those 5 Republican justices are quite ideological, they are not completely blind to reality. So that could be one way of doing it. Another way of doing it would be amending the Constitution. And that's possible. It's hard to do. I do not, by the way, recommend an Article 5 Constitutional Convention. That is a way of amending the Constitution, but it is very dangerous, because once it's convened, nobody has any control over what they may do. And in this kind of polarized atmosphere and polarized politics, I hate to think what might happen. All right, last question. Ken Johnson. The resistance seems more focused on what it is against than what it is for. Can progressives develop more positive messaging based on issues like healthcare and tax reform? Ken, absolutely they can, and they will, and they should, and I think it's only a matter of time. I think progressives need to take on, and you, I think, put your finger on some of them, a single party healthcare plan, which is basically Medicare for all. It's going to be obvious that this is necessary, if it's not already obvious to people, because we're already spending more than any other country on healthcare and getting the worst healthcare, because all of the profits are going to basically profit-centered, private, for-profit healthcare companies that are rewarding their executives huge amounts of money, spending giant amounts of money on marketing and publicity, and not giving health care. Another very, very important, I think, issue is going to be tax reform. We've got to raise taxes on the rich and reduce taxes on everybody else, and people will see that. Will see how important that is. Another has to do with education. We've got to have world-class education from pre-K, that is, right from early childhood education all the way through at least 2, if not 4 years of higher education. And it's got to be available to everybody. Universal, free public education. That's what this country was built on. That's what democracy requires. And we've also got to get big money out of politics. Now, those are just 4. And I've neglected many other provisions. I think what progressives ought to do, and I will help, and I have been trying to help, is come up with not a gigantic list, but maybe 5 or 6 or 7 key principles for the future that will make America better off, that will make all or most Americans better off, that will put this country back on track. Because right now, Ken and others, we are in a vicious cycle in which we have elected an authoritarian populist who's really part of the plutocracy, oligarchy in this country, who's making life worse and will make life worse for the poor and the working class and much of the middle class. They will become increasingly angry, and if they don't understand what's happening, if they don't get the truth, they could elect, because they are so angry, even more demagogues in the future. We could have a whole string of demagogues, and you can see how that vicious cycle can just become even more vicious, with the people at the top, the privileged, the rich, laughing all the way to the bank. But they won't be laughing all the way to the bank, because at some point these demagogues are going to undermine, if not destroy, the entire American economy. So we can't afford it. They can't afford it. They would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing, more equitable economy than they are doing now with a gigantic share of an economy that is not growing at all and is highly polarized, and a politics that is poisonous. Let me thank producer Yael Bridge and associate producer Sasha Leitman. And also thank you all again for all of your work. You are actually making the resistance a reality. Many of you, I know, are now practicing resistance activism. And that is critically important if we're going to turn this around. Not only resisting Trump, but also advancing the progressive agenda we were just talking about. We need you. We need your activism. Indeed, it is the only hope for the future. That's the end of tonight's Resistance Report. I will not see you tomorrow night, but I will see you Friday.